Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donna Hicks, and I'm the chair of the Herbert C. Kelman Seminar. And welcome. We are so grateful that you've taken time to be with us today. We have a fascinating presentation and so timely given what's happening in the world today. I just wanted to point out that this seminar is co-sponsored by the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard. So let me just give you a, first, before I even give you an overview of the format, I want to thank my partners who made this seminar possible. We have Nicole Bryant, we have Lindsay Sullivan, Diane Long, Lara San Pietro. It takes the village to create a seminar like this, so we're grateful to everyone. I also wanted to let you know that we have three people today, and what we're going to do is, as usual, I will introduce the participants in the seminar, and then Mark Muller will speak, followed by Dr. Houda Abadi, and then followed by Eldridge Adolfo. And then we're going to turn it over to you for the Q&A. So please, there's a Q&A function, and please put your questions there, and I will moderate that session, and I will, all of the participants will be up on the screen, and we can have a back and forth with questions from you, the audience. And I wanted to also remind you that we always record these Kelman seminars, so you can, in a couple of days, if you want to refer this to someone, or if you want to watch it again, you can go to the Program on Negotiation website and click on events, and you'll see the recording. So let me just introduce our panelists here. As you know, they're going to be talking about international norms and Islamic principles, exploring commonalities for peace building. And we have Dr. Houda Abadi, and she's the Executive Director of Transformative Peace, a consulting firm specializing in inclusive peace processes, women, peace and security, and human rights-based approaches to preventing violent conflicts and violent extremism. She has over 15 years of extensive experience designing and implementing peace-building programs in the US, Europe, and in the MENA region. Dr. Abadi works with a wide range of stakeholders to facilitate dialogue and promote peace building in sensitive conflict zones such as Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Palestine, and Syria. Then we have Mark Muller. Actually, Mark is going to be the first person in the seminar giving his remarks. Mark is a professor of practice at Edinburgh University Law School and the London School of Economics, where he directs the International Norms Project. He's also the founder of Beyond Borders Scotland, a Scottish-based dialogue and peace-building organization dedicated to international cultural and policy exchange. Since 2015, Mark has acted as a senior mediation advisor to the United Nations Department of Political and Peace-Building Affairs Mediation Support Unit, advising various UN special envoys and representatives, including in relation to Syria, Yemen, Libya, Sudan, South Sudan, Iraq, Georgia, and Afghanistan. And he is, at this moment, advising the special envoy to Syria, just so you know. So we are thrilled to have him. And finally, we have Eldridge Adolfo. He is the Senior Advisor of Dialogue and Mediation in the Folk Bernadette Academy in Stockholm. He has extensive experience in mediating and negotiating with armed conflict parties, process design, developing transnational arrangements, mediation, and preventive diplomacy. He was previously mediation advisor at the European External Action Service and with the UN. He's a mediation advisor to several special envoys and special representatives of the Secretary General. He was a conflict researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala, Sweden, and with the Swedish Defense Research Agency. He has worked in Latin America, Europe, Africa, and Asia peace processes. So welcome to all of them. As you can see, this is going to be a rich discussion. They have experience in Syria, so I'm sure that's going to come up in the Q&A at some point. So I'm going to invite Mark to turn his video on, and I'm going to go into the background.
Well, thank you very much, Donna, and it's an absolute pleasure to take part in this webinar. I should say that I spent 3 happy years on and off at Harvard Law School at the Human Rights Center there in between 2011 and 14. So very fond memories. I think what I'm going to do is just share with you a few slides, effectively telling you a little bit about the background of a new guide that has been published by the London School of Economics and FBA, who Eldridge represents, a guide to peacemaking using Islamic principles. And what I'm simply going to do is tell you a little bit about the guide, how it came about. But I perhaps should first of all just say that there's 3 of us here today, but this whole project would not have come about without also me mentioning the contribution of our 4th colleague, Ibrahim Rasool, who was the former, is the former Premier of the Western Cape, and has recently taken up the ambassadorship for South Africa to the United States. So we wish him well, but you should know that he plays a fundamental role in everything that we have developed, both in relation to the research project and the guide itself. So this guide was really based upon research undertaken by the LSE's International Norms Project, which ran between 2019 and 22 and was launched in support of the Afghan Doha peace process back then. In the summer of 2019, myself and Eldridge were asked by the EU Special Envoy and other bodies to bring together a group of policy makers, military, peace and academic practitioners to see how we might be able to develop some programs that could support a more inclusive intra-Afghan dialogue, which was being suggested as forming part of the Afghan Doha peace process. That conference came up with about 12 recommendations, of which 2 were taken forward. One was the creation of the Afghan Mechanism for Inclusive Peace, which brought together about 1,500 Afghan civil society organizations to support the Doha peace process. And Eldridge was critical in developing this, along with my advice, and managed to sign MOUs with both the Afghan government and the Taliban to enable civil society to communicate its demands. The second was the International Norms Project run by the LSE in partnership with FBA and Uppsala University. And what this did was to try and identify commonalities between universal norms and Islam, including in relation to modes of transitional governments, with a view to supporting the peace process talks. And it was in that context that we reached out to both Ambassador Rasool and Dr. Houda Abadi to help excavate these norms and commonalities. And that was the first part of IMP2. The second part was to use that research, which they undertook, to try and see whether we could create a more Muslim-friendly, normative compliant, gender mainstream conflict resolution framework for use in Muslim majority contexts, and to provide negotiators with a language around which different Afghan entities cohere. And as a result of all of that research, we then brought it to Muslim scholars from across the world and sitting next to international peace process designers and veteran Muslim political leaders to try and develop and stress test the framework. And we had the Istanbul Conference on Muslim Statecraft in February 2022, and a whole series of online conferences as well, including with women from Afghanistan and from across the MENA region and beyond. And they all together endorsed the framework, which then led to a more general guide to help better situate contemporary forms of peacemaking directed at Muslim-majority societies. Now, we all know about the fall of Kabul, and as a consequence of that, the Istanbul Conference recommended that we perhaps try and develop a guide that can be of more general application across the world. And so that is what the guide seeks to do. But let me just talk a little bit about its methodology, if we could go to the next slide. So the methodology was, first of all, to adopt a first principle approach by identifying a near universal set of gender-sensitive, inclusive-making principles which unite rather than divide Muslim communities. And so we looked, first of all, at the prophetic tradition, the Quran, the last sermon, and the early experiences of the Prophet and his companion. And we did this in order to try and find, if you like, a set of universal principles which unite rather than divide the different Muslim communities, including avoiding the Sunni-Shia split. So this guide takes a number of fundamental principles that are found in early Islam. But just to be clear, it is aimed at the international conflict resolvers rather than Muslim communities. And it's designed to help enhance contemporary forms of peacekeeping, particularly in Muslim majority societies experiencing conflict, by making them more culturally sensitive and sustainable. It does not purport to tell the Muslim community, in effect, how to set eggs, or purport to be either a definitive or comprehensive history or a commentary on Islamic history. It is part of an iterative process and an ongoing dialogue between Muslim and religious scholars and political transitional leaders and peace practitioners. So if we can just turn to the contents of it, the next slide, please. What the guide does is describe an ecosystem of Islamic peacemaking based around 4 pillars. 7 foundational principles, which I'll go to in the next slide, but which were excavated by both Dr. Houda Abadi and Ibrahim Rasool to provide an overarching positive peace framework. The second was to draw upon the Maqasid al-Sharia, which consists of the divine intents of Islam as opposed to the human interpretation of Israel. And we say that this gives birth to a rights-based approach. The third pillar was to draw upon the prophetic tradition, including various laws of war that were developed during the early practices of the Prophet Muhammad and his companion, including the duty to negotiate peace. And the fourth concerns transitional governance, drawing upon the Charter of Medina and the inclusive citizen-based state. Together, they all place duties on conflict actors to seek positive peace and to build a just society. So let's just have a quick look at those different pillars. The first pillar are the 7 foundational principles. And if you have a look at the slide, the next slide, these on one level seem very obvious, but obviously they help the international conflict resolver, if you like, embed and enhance their own approaches towards inclusive peacemaking. And so they emphasize unity, peace, diversity, justice, mercy, dignity, and balance. All of these can be found throughout the Quran and the early practices of the Prophet Muhammad, including, if you like, a more positive notion of peace that is slightly different from Western conceptions of peace and justice, where sometimes we talk about non-interference with rights, whereas actually this form of justice is a much more communal, based upon equity and fairness. And this may have significant implications for the international conflict resolver when trying to build a transitional governance arrangement in times of conflict. Just turning to the next pillar, the Maqasid al-Sharia, in the next slide. The Maqasid al-Sharia, as I said, consists of 6 divine higher intents or objects of Islam. And it is to be distinguished to the relationship to Usul al-Fiqh, which really relates to the human interpretation of Islam, which developed into the various different Sharia schools of thought around the world. What the Maqasid al-Sharia emphasizes the concept of permissibility, and that means that everything is permissible unless it's forbidden, expressly forbidden. And so it connects up with the concept of conditional rights and some of the normative synergies that you might find in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And one of the reasons why we've adopted this is because we're plainly aware of the different types of cultural traditions in different places that have developed, in which gender dynamics and patriarchal attitudes can sometimes affect the nature of the different schools of Sharia thought. So if we just quickly go to the next slide, that just simply shows you very quickly how some of the 6 divine intents connect up to a rights-based framework. So I'll just read the first one. From the preservation of offspring derives the rights of the family. From the preservation of mind derives the rights to knowledge and access to information, and so on. I'm conscious of time, so let me go to the 3rd pillar in the next slide. So this is the 3rd pillar that you will find in the guide, useful chapters on the prophetic tradition and the laws of war. And so what we've done here is look at some of these commonalities and connect them up to, if you like, classic conflict and peacemaking issues. And there is a clear prophetic tradition that imposes a duty to negotiate wherever and whenever possible peace, the concept of Hudna. These were all developed during the Prophet Muhammad's experiences. And also you will find all sorts of other concepts in the guide, like Dahara, do no harm, Fitna, avoid mischievous transgressions, and Sul, the binding nature of treaty making. And one particular thing that we emphasize in the guide is also the concept of strategic patience. When the Prophet Muhammad negotiated the Treaty of Houda, for example, he negotiated a more inclusive transitional arrangements, which fell short, if you like, of the ideal Muslim state, but applying the principle that there is a duty wherever and whenever, if possible, to negotiate peace. This included the creation of transitional modes of governance, which, if it reduced violence, was a duty to try and negotiate. And so just turning to the next slide, the guide also drew upon the Charter of Medina. Again, this was not a perfect expression of the Muslim ideal state, but was justified by the exigencies as a stepping stone to building a just and inclusive society. And you will see that part of the Charter of Medina, which is drawn from various historical sources, emphasized the principle of inclusion, all equal citizens, of the equality before the war, all equally judged, freedom of belief, the equality of obligations, where rights were commensurate with responsibilities, including costs of defense, and the fundamental principle of shura, the duty to consult and ensure popular approval of governance arrangements, which have developed in many different ways in many different Islamic societies since then. But the principle of consultation is critical and relevant to negotiations concerning transitional governance arrangements in times of conflict and comply with in Islamic norms. So you will hopefully appreciate that this approach is an attempt to try and allow international conflict resolvers and policymakers who are often working within Muslim majority societies to translate some of the international normative approaches towards peacemaking into language that is more sensitive and culturally relevant and religiously relevant. Today, we have, 70% of the world's conflict involving billions of Muslims affecting Muslim majority societies. And in our view, having done many literature reviews and talked to many different international conflict resolvers, there's a recognition that the international community has often failed to resolve conflicts or they have stalled in these Muslim majority societies. So this is an attempt to try and help enhance those processes and to provide an ecosystem, a positive force to good, which can be married up to other forms of best practice, forms of peacemaking based upon similar norms. So that really is the guide. There's a couple of other slides, but I'll just flag them up, but I'll leave them for Houda to talk about. So if we go just to the last two. This is, sorry, if you go to the one before, the first slide is a slide about Islam and transitional governance. I'll leave it to Eldridge to talk about this a little bit more. But what this slide does is provide, if you like, a sliding continuum of different forms of state formation. And the three ones in the middle give different sort of state formations in which religion plays a less or more positive role in society. They're all consistent with, if you like, the Islamic commonalities and synergies and principles that we've set out. But it provides, if you like, a menu for not only negotiators, but Muslim societies to choose from when developing transitional governance arrangements in times of conflict. And this may well also apply very much to the type of decisions that will have to take place in Syria. Lastly, the last slide is a slide concerning women, peace, and security. I will not take you through it, but it gives you 5, if you like, elements of that chapter about the inclusive power of the 7 principles, how to deal with gender dynamics, norms, and human interpretation of divine texts, the role of women in early Islam, and how to build a sufficient and new consensus around these principles, and in particular, strategies for women's rights and participation, all developed by Dr. Houda Abadi in consultation with all the people that we talked about, Muslim scholars, international peacemakers, Muslim transitional leaders. So I hope that sets the scene for our reflections about this important topic. But we believe that this guide has come at a very opportune moment and it's long overdue. And one last thing, in terms of literature reviews, there are not many guides at all that cover this type of normative framework in existence in English. There are some guides from Georgetown University concerning religion and the role of religion and peacemaking, but we think that this actually adds to the peace building attempts to try and solve and resolve conflicts in Muslim majority societies. So that's all I'll say, Donna. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this introductory presentation. And I've not kept an eye on the clock. I hope I'm not too much over the time allotted.
Okay, so now we are going to hear from Dr. Houda Abadi, and I'm going to disappear and let Dr. Houda take over.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. Warm greetings from Morocco. It is with the great honor and privilege to be amongst you today. From experience working as a practitioner, also as a researcher, I have seen how bottom-up approaches to conflict resolution and the world's most pressing issues is what really makes peace inclusive, transformative, and sustainable. And what we have seen is when Western conceptions of conflict resolution alone are used as the benchmark, they often overlook local, traditional, or religious nuance that is important. And this can delegitimize the process and not give it a chance to take root because it does not build on local ownership and sustainability. This is particularly detrimental in Muslim-majority countries and contexts since the dominant global discourse overlooks pluralism within Muslim communities. Sometimes it ascribes negative meanings to Islamic systems. We can just open the media and hear it. And it also erases the region's historical and social specificities. And as such, integrating local and international frameworks together in peace building is important. And I'm going to highlight three main reasons. One is because it builds on the local capacities, the resources, knowledge, and local realities that are not based on outside templates if we're looking for sustainability. Two, it brings legitimacy to the process and allows for local ownership. And I want to give an example as a women faith-based leader stated in one of the projects that I was working on that used this Islamic framework, quote, she stated, "For the first time, I feel I'm not a lab rat experiment. I'm not talked down to, but we are respected and listened to," end of quote. Another male faith-based leader took some of the WPS Islamic frameworks in the workshops and started his own project with young men at the mosque and called it prophetic masculinity to reimagine healthy masculinities. And what does that mean? Looking at the example of the prophet. You see, we can't deny, regardless of our personal views on religion and secularism, that religion plays a vitally important role in Muslim majority societies. Within Muslim majority societies, it therefore makes sense for peace builders to reflect not only on what we always hear on the media, how Islam is instrumentalized to influence violent conflicts, but actually on the ways Islam can help resolve violent conflict and what principles can we take to try to find solutions outside of the box. Even in our research in Afghanistan, when the perceptions of human rights were seen by Afghans not aligned with the Sharia, they were much more less likely to accept it. And so as such, adopting an Islamic framework in these settings is an attractive idea because one, it bridges the gap between the global north and the global south, which is sorely needed, and we see what is happening in the world right now. For instance, understanding Islamic peace building equips especially Western mediators and peace builders to navigate cultural nuances and avoid misunderstandings that can hinder negotiations. For instance, just the meaning of a mediator, the understanding of a mediator that is seen in a lot of Muslim majority countries, not as someone who is neutral, and there's not the same understanding of impartiality and neutrality. It is seen as someone who is trusted within the community, has deep-rooted social networks, and actually is capable of exerting influence. So knowledge of these nuances fosters trust and credibility, but also provides an informed engagement with more of a likelihood to get some buy-in. Second, it creates more of an opening to address harmful norms and barriers to inclusion through a framework that is much more likely to be accepted and adopted by local communities. And this is especially important when we talk about women, peace, and security, which I will discuss later in my intervention. And third, it puts a focus on the process the focus is also on the process, and it's not just on getting a peace agreement, because Islam places a strong emphasis on relational networks and social cohesion, such as wasata, which is mediation, sulh, reconciliation, hiwar, dialogue, adl, justice, shura, which is consultation, and hudna, truce or ceasefire. So the end goal for peace building is not just a cessation of violence, but also equally important is the restoration of societal unity and justice. Positive peace is a very important concept within the understanding of Islamic frameworks of peace building. And it is tied as a collective responsibility to actually justice. And if we're looking at the biography of Prophet Muhammad and his companions, it shows that they had alliances, constitution, pacts, and treaties with various non-Muslim communities for the purpose of improving international and interfaith relations, protecting mutual rights and obligations, and also building more peaceful societies. And lastly, it converges with fundamental international humanitarian norms, meaning that the adoption of an Islamic framework would not come at the expense of the fundamental human rights. And at the same time, it would resonate with the target audience that can make the difference between success and failure. However, what it does not mean, which is sometimes the question that I always get, it does not mean that it is imposing or affirming religious law or eliminating the secular space or not respecting fundamental human rights. The relationship between human rights and Islam needs to be framed in terms of synergy and mutual influence rather than a permanent state of antagonism. And in fact, Islam is fundamentally rooted in the same tenets of peace, equity, and justice that is lauded in the Western world. However, what is really important, and Mark spoke a little bit about it, and this is why we focused on the first principles, is that there is a plurality of interpretation even within Islamic jurisprudence over law and governance, political power, and civic life, varying through time and space. And so, for instance, we can see that while the Taliban was insisting on certain Islamic principles, it continues to remain ambiguous on how they deploy these Islamic references. So it's important to define these terms and concepts to close the gap and close this ambiguity. For instance, what does the Taliban mean when it says we're going to be respecting women's rights according to the Sharia or to the Islamic tenets? What do they mean by that? They still have not defined it. So to build sufficient consensus, there needs to be clarity on what these terms mean for the different parties, including the emotions, the fears, and the insecurities that are invoked by them as well, and the words that we use. And so by exploring these issues further, we're creating more of a space of dialogue, and trust-building mechanisms can be created. And as Mark said, I have to mention, which is very important, on women's approaching gender equality and discussing women, peace, and security. So approaching gender equality only through a secular lens may deprive gendered frameworks from sources of religious legitimacy and values that could empower actually women's rights and facilitate the renegotiation of gender norms and relationships. Engaging with religious contexts can facilitate the renegotiation of gender norms, promoting positive reinterpretation of these norms. It is critical to dismantle the false dichotomies often associated with Islam, particularly regarding women's rights. An Islamic framework is fully reconcilable, and women's inclusion is a must for sustainable peace. The historic examples from the Quran and the lives of the Prophet, which the guide highlights, can inform new understanding and a reimagining of masculinity and femininity. And this opens a space for women's participation and expands the roles of both women and men in the private and public spheres. And values relating to women's inclusion within Islam are supported by not just the number of women that are mentioned through the Islamic tradition that have played prominent roles, but really what is really important to highlight is the centrality and the importance of those roles, for instance, which included women's active participation in selecting the Prophet to lead the Muslims. So Islamic frameworks can serve as a powerful source of legitimacy for gender equality, countering cultural norms that perpetuate patriarchal or tribal norms. These frameworks reflect Quranic values, contrasting with customary practices. And some of you might be thinking, well, you know, we hear also about, we still hear that there are issues with women's rights. Yes, absolutely. Women still face significant barriers that include patriarchal and cultural norms at the local level. There's a lack of accountability and implementation mechanism, but there's also instrumentalization by national and foreign policy agendas. And many of the local socio-cultural norms that limit women's rights in Muslim majority countries often are framed or justified in religious or Islamic terms, but are in fact judicial human interpretation of the religious law that is rooted in tribalism or patriarchal customs. And this is why it becomes even more important to use Islamic religious frameworks to be able to distinguish between what is religiously rooted and what is rooted in custom. And this opens a new understanding for women's position in societies, but it also opens space to finding common ground where religion can become a lucrative source for intersectional common ground rather than the local context. This distinction opens possibilities for the reinterpretation in a manner less prone to evoking defensiveness. And the conflation of the two closes those possibilities by reinforcing these inequalities that support patriarchal religious interpretation. So the diversity of political and theological debates over gender equality really highlights the importance of framing, either in terms of the language we use or the methods and the approaches. We have seen how gender equality is continually negotiated, articulated, and contested. And Islamic law can hold greater credibility amongst local communities. And I can say this by experience working in different Muslim majority countries such as Morocco to Iraq, in Tunisia. Women's rights advocates have increasingly adopted Islamic legal frameworks and historic examples to promote women's rights and respond to the customary laws that have been discriminatory towards them and to renegotiate those norms. I want to conclude very quickly with 5 quick takeaways. Language matters and it can evoke visceral emotions. That's first. Language can either be used to protect women's freedoms or to discriminate against them. And as such, it becomes critical to frame the conflict constructively to encourage productive communication, define the terms and concepts, and to close the gaps of ambiguity and build sufficient consensus. For instance, when I do women, peace, and security or gender mainstreaming workshops, and I use the word feminism in a Muslim majority country, or for instance, in some marginalized neighborhoods within Morocco, it ascribes 100% negative, there's negative emotions tied to that word. And so it doesn't become productive for me to use that. Whereas when I'm using something that is seen much more as local and they understand, I can get more of a space to be able to have this conversation. Second, women's rights should not be viewed in isolation, but as part of democratization and protection of human rights for all. So it should not be even within the peace process as an afterthought. Social and economic rights are essential and facilitate women's meaningful participation in political process. And a whole of society approach will enable different entry points where gender equality is not a zero-sum game. And so it's not a competition between men versus women, but more we're looking at it from the health of the community and the well-being of all community members. Third, inclusion of women from various different backgrounds is critical. A lot of times rural women or more conservative religious women are not included within the negotiation process. And so we also need to avoid a savior mentality and instrumentalization of women. We have to address the differential vulnerabilities and unequal power relationships. Fourth, a secular approach imposed by international bodies will not resolve these conflicts. The international community needs to also distance itself from patriarchal interpretation of Islam as authoritative and give Muslim women the space and agency to change the terms of reference from when. They have the agency to promote inclusion and diversity through a humanist reading of the Quran and prophetic tradition, which is key to gender equality and addressing gender bias. And lastly, my last takeaway is that mediators can draw on Islamic jurisprudence when showcasing the varied Islamic opinions on the subject matter. Integrating indigenous forms of conflict resolution is in non-Western context is important for building legitimacy, responding to local needs, understanding the local context, and building upon local capacities and knowledge. Thank you so much.
Okay, Eldridge, you're up. I'm not going to take any time, so just turn your video on and I'm gone. Thank you. And
thank you, Donna. Thanks.
Houda, excuse me, Houda, could you turn your camera off? Thank you. Okay.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Sorry, we've obviously gone over time, so I'll be brief in out of respect for the participants if they want to ask some questions. So I won't take as long. Just very quickly, I'll talk about just more from the practical application of the guide. My colleagues have already spoken about how it's been created, and they've gone through the whole guide. So I don't need to go through that again with you. But safe to say that what this essentially was an exercise in strategic empathy, in that instead of what was happening at the time, we were in a set of negotiations, and I realized that we were speaking above each other. Nobody understood each other's language. And what we needed to do was to pause and go have a look at the other side's worldview. What is it that they see? How do they see things? What is it important for them? Because the whole idea that, and this has been the case, I suppose, for a while, that we could just introduce the liberal peace and try and implement that. But what does that mean for these other societies? What we found out is that a lot of the things that we talk about in terms of human rights, international norms, are very common to Muslim societies and any other society. This just becomes a one on Islamic principles because we were dealing with an Islamic case, but of course you could still use this methodology in other cases as well. But the point being that a lot of the things were common, except that when you came and said, we want to implement a human rights perspective, this was seen in a different light by the parties on the ground. On the ground, they were found it as more of an intrusive way of intervening in their conflict, coming with external ideas and these sort of things, values to impose upon them. Whereas as soon as we started to say, okay, but let's look at the Quran, and I think my colleagues have talked about the fact that we remained at the original texts, you could pick up a lot of these things there as well. And the example, very simple example, just so that it's easy to communicate, was the consultation. We discussed about consultations, and one of the parties said, absolutely not. We will not consult with anybody because consultations means that we have to listen to civil society, and that civil society is just Western backed and Western funded. It's got nothing to do with us. But we came back again and said, listen, can we do a shura instead? And that really changed things around very, very quickly. They said, okay, well, of course we can do a shura. That's in our culture. We do that all the time. Yes, shura is of course acceptable. And so then we could now, by speaking their language, we could start to turn things around and start to see it from their perspective. Because that is the key thing in all of what we were doing here, is trying to understand somebody else's worldview. And by understanding it, speak to them about the same things in their worldview. So I gave the example simply of a consultation, but there were also other things that we could talk about as well, where we just looked at it from their perspective. Now, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that we throw away all our principles and throw away all the international norms or anything like that. Not at all. The guide says peacemaking, guide to peacemaking using Islamic principles. And then the subtext is the commonalities between international norms and Islamic principles. And that has been our focus. We've been looking at where do we find the commonalities? And many places we did find the common stuff. It's just that we wanted the same thing, but we called it different things, or we approached it in the wrong manner, and therefore it became a problem in trying to get an agreement on these things. And that's basically the long and short of it. I will say just a couple more things in terms of the transitional governance aspects. Again, and we'll see this in Syria now as well, that there will have to be some sort of governance structure that's created, that's set up for people to move into and live into. And we looked at this year, and some of it again, and we must credit Ambassador Rasul a lot for this. A lot of his original thinking went into that part. Is that there are ways of preserving international norms, preserving a lot of the things that we have in a democracy, constitution, Bill of Rights, all of these sort of things, institutions, but you could do it on a gradient scale. Now, in Islam, one thing we found out, and again, we found this out, but Muslims know this already, so it's not a discovery, you already knew this, was there was a concept of wasata, which is moving to the center or balance, trying to balance things out, come to the center. And that's what we try to do with the 5 modes of statecraft that we've set up there, where you move from a type of governance structure that is secular, and that means it's equidistant to all religions, right? And this is not acceptable to some people. In some cultures, we found this out as well. In this case, we're dealing with Islam, so I'll say in Muslim majority countries, religion plays a big role. And so you cannot ignore it. I'm not saying that you need to embrace everything within it, but you have to frame some of your discussions around that. I could say the same thing in Colombia, where religion played a role, and we saw that in the referendum, where Christianity and the Catholic Church played a role against certain points in the agreement. So it's not just Islam, but it is in other cultures too. But acknowledging that religion plays a role in some of these places, we also have another type of state, a second type of state, which we call the civil state. And this one allows the same things we said, the constitution. Have I run out of time, Donna?
Yes, I mean, we have several questions.
Okay,
I'm
that's fine.
terribly
That's fine.
sorry,
No, that's fine.
Eldridge, but
That's fine.
our
That's fine. We'll take the questions. I'll have to respect the participants instead. Okay.
Of course. Okay, let me just move on here. Thank you, though, Eldridge. I'm sorry we had to cut you off because you have so much important things to say. I'm terribly sorry.
That's fine, Donna.
Yeah, here's the first question. Compared to other religions or belief systems that exist in the world, what did you find in your research that could explain the reason why conflicts regarding Islam and Muslim majority countries have been so difficult to resolve? And Houda and Mark, you should come back on the screen too, because you can help answer these as well. So put your videos on, Houda and Mark. There we go. Where's Houda? Here she is. Okay. So did you all hear that question?
Maybe you could read it again. You could just say it again, please.
Sure. Compared to other religions or belief systems that exist in the world, what did you find in your research that could explain the reasons why conflicts regarding Islam and Muslim majority countries have been so difficult to resolve?
Okay, I'll go first. Well, I think that in the research, what we found was that it's not necessarily or particular to Islam or Muslim majority countries that is hard to resolve. One of the challenges is exactly what we're saying, is that when international conflict resolvers come and try and help resolve the conflict, they are not looking at it from the perspective of the parties. We're looking at it from our own perspective, coming in with an international framework and saying, this is how you need to do things, without actually taking a second and saying, but hold on, what is it on the other side that's important to them, and how do we connect these two? So I think that's one of the reasons why. It's not all of the reasons, it's just one.
Anybody, Mark or Houda?
Absolutely, I agree. I'm just going to add something very quickly. I think there's nothing unique about it, actually, but unfortunately, we have to look at it from a historical context as well. There has been occupation, imperialism, colonial powers that have not been resolved at all. And we see it right now, what is happening in Palestine, what is happening specifically in Gaza. So we have to be honest and have an honest conversation and say the way that we've been doing peace building has failed as an international community. And we need to reimagine peace building and to have more humility and active listening and to really, really understand, to listen to local communities and to also address the biases, the foreign biases, and to also respond to the double hypocrisy unfortunately, but is the reality of the region.
Yeah, I mean, I would just simply add that virtually all conflicts that I have dealt with, one of the underlying drivers of it is some form of exclusion, either in fact or perceived exclusion. And also conflicts which are impacted by contested identities, sometimes imposed upon players and parties by outside forces. And so I think when it comes to Islam, there have been a number of different false binaries that have been set up sometimes between Islam and human rights, between Islam and the rules-based order, between Western conceptions or normative conceptions and Islam, all of which I think in this research we found to be false, and that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other normative instruments of the United Nations are based upon normative standards from many different faiths and traditions and cultures from around the world. And one of the most important things today, I think, is for us to avoid this notion that just because of the double standards that Houda is talking about, which undoubtedly exists perhaps in relation to Ukraine and Gaza and such like, that we somehow suggest that there are all these different silos out there in terms of normative frameworks, when in actual fact, there is a universal set of standards about, if you like, human dignity and rules of war and all of this type of stuff. But if you ask me why it's so difficult sometimes in conflicts involving Muslim majority societies, it's because we're all bringing our different histories and perspectives to them. And sometimes we have international conflict resolvers who are doing their level best, but are not using the type of language and approaches that Houda was setting out in relation to women, peace and security. And what we felt, and I'll just finish here, but in some of our conversations with Muslim mullahs and whatnot in Afghanistan, was as soon as we started approaching those same issues, those same norms, but in a different language and with a greater degree of respect, the conversation opened out. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily going to happen with men with guns, but I am very, very confident that if you're talking about an inclusive process of peacemaking involving civil society and women, we will be able to find a language that reflects the needs of ordinary people, including in Muslim societies, and we are going to find that they're not far different from every other type of conflict. Each conflict may be unique, but they have similarities. And these normative instruments that we've been identifying, both in Islam and in Western forms of normative instruments, really have the same root. So whilst I accept that it's been difficult because of these false binaries to sometimes resolve these conflicts, I agree with Houda that ultimately then that they have similarities with all sorts of conflicts around the world, of which really exclusion is the driver.
Okay, I think we'll have time for one more question. And this, I think, is a good one to explore. What are the specific examples of stumbling blocks in negotiating with the Taliban or other Islamic-leaning entities? And how does this framework that you've presented help overcome these problems?
Well, I'll just give you one quick example that when I was advising the UN Special Envoy to Yemen, and this sort of draws upon something that Houda said. We spent a lot of time trying to explain to local, on-the-ground Muslim communities that the UN envoy was impartial and neutral. And of course, as Houda said, many of these local communities were looking to something else. They wanted an envoy who was trusted, who had authority, who had the capacity to knock heads together because he had credibility with the different groups. And we suddenly began to realize that, the way we were describing our role and what we were offering to many local communities was just simply not understood. And so that's why I'm saying those subtle types of differences, it's important for us to understand them, especially when we are going around appointing, if you like, sometimes non-Muslim UN envoys to effectively negotiate the peace deals involving Muslim majority societies. Now, there are others as well, but that's just a very quick and short example.
Yeah, I would say that one of the stumbling blocks, particularly today as well, is not necessarily to just do with Muslim societies themselves. It is also because of the world and global, the geopolitical shift we're in right now. So to some extent, the problem doesn't lie in the country or with the Muslims. It actually lies with the political forces or powers outside who are themselves instigating or inflaming a war. So sometimes it's not just about the community. So we need to be able to look at that as well, be able to work at that level as well, at the geopolitical level. Otherwise, we can work with the parties or people on the ground as much as we like. If you cannot get a handle on what's happening with the geopolitical side of things, that will be a problem. Secondly, we talk again about our own frameworks. We come with our own frameworks. Again, some sort of training and knowledge, and this guide is a start to that, to international conflict resolvers, that you need to be able to take the other side's view and worldview into account. That will go get over some of the stumbling blocks. But as we're going right now, where we just constantly go our way, is not going to help.
Dr. Abadi, do you want to add to that?
Very quickly, I think the only little thing I'm going to mention is that we also have dehumanized an entire population and an entire region. And this is why sometimes even some of these questions is there's nothing unique about Muslims or Muslim countries per se. But because of dehumanization, because of the way they have been portrayed in the media, reduced, and what we see every day, we are seeing it every day in our screens, minute by minute. But we have normalized this in some parts of the world. And we, when I say the international community per se, has to really look back and say, what do we mean by peace building? How can we have, and how can we ensure international human rights are going to apply to everyone, and making sure that we don't lose that value? The second thing is that we have to amplify voices from the global South, and we have to decolonize conflict resolution and peace building, not because Western conceptions of, or global North conceptions of conflict resolutions, something is missing, but we need to integrate both of them if we really want to listen and create sustainable peace building, because we have failed in creating sustainable peace. And so even a lot of times we have an agreement, and then a few years it fails, and then it becomes even more violent. And so we have to reimagine it, where we question, how can we ensure that there is local ownership and sustainability? And we can only do that by looking at indigenous forms of peace building as well, and incorporate it as a global whole.
That's I think a very important point to close on. And let me just thank the three of you profoundly for these efforts. And I have a feeling that you're going to be working pretty hard, all of you, in Syria, with all these insights and the beautiful research that you've done. So many, many thanks. I'm quickly going to turn it over to my colleague, Nicole Bryant, so that she can close it out with the upcoming events at PON. And thank you, thank you, thank you.
I will echo
Thank
Donna,
you.
but not make our time longer by saying thank you as well. And just let everyone know that this event concludes our 2024 events for the program on negotiation. We are going to take a short holiday break and resume with a couple of events in January and February. So I would like to thank all of our community for being with us over the course of the many events that we have put on this year. If you are curious about them or missed some, please visit the PON website. We have recordings of absolutely everything we've done this year and in previous years. And we hope to see you kicking off on January 23rd with Max Bevilacqua, or at one of our online or in-person training programs, online or here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So thank you to everyone. Happy holidays to those who are celebrating them. And we look forward to gathering again together in 2025. Thank you. Have a great day.